For over half a century, Engelbert Humperdinck has been the undisputed king of romance, serenading millions with promises of unbreakable devotion. To the world, he was the velvet-voiced crooner who could do no wrong. But behind the glittering Vegas marquise and the flawless smile lay a fiercely guarded reality that completely contradicted his pristine public image. Now, at 90 years old, the legendary singer is stepping out of the shadows to shatter the very illusion he spent a lifetime building. He's finally breaking his silence on the bitter rivalries, the devastating personal betrayals, and the tragic family secrets he desperately tried to hide. Just how dark did his life truly get when the stage lights finally went out? Picture a man, now 90 years old, sitting quietly in a dimly lit room. The deafening roar of arenas has faded into silence, replaced by the ticking of a clock and the heavy weight of memory. When we hear the name Engelbert Humperdinck, we instantly hear that soaring, velvet voice begging, "Please release me. Let me go." We see the immaculate sideburns, the tailored tuxedos, and the cheeky wink that could make 1,000 women swoon in a single heartbeat. For over 50 years, he was the undisputed, untouchable king of romance. But what if I told you that the man who sang those immortal love songs didn't actually exist? What if the perfect gentleman was nothing more than a brilliantly orchestrated, psychological illusion designed to manipulate millions? To understand the scale of the lie, we have to rewind to a time before the fame, before the glitz, and before the absurdly magnificent stage name. Long before he was Engelbert, he was simply Arnold Dorsey, a struggling, deeply insecure singer from Leicester, England. Arnold was talented, sure, but his powerful voice wasn't enough in the gritty, fiercely competitive club scene of the early 1960s. For years, Arnold clawed at the doors of the music industry, only to have them slammed in his face. He contracted tuberculosis, nearly died, and watched his dreams evaporate. He was broke, desperate, and entirely out of options. He realized a terrifying truth. The world didn't want Arnold Dorsey. If he was going to survive, Arnold had to die. Enter Gordon Mills, a ruthless, visionary music manager who didn't just see a singer. He saw raw clay waiting to be molded. Mills understood a fundamental secret of the music industry. Audiences don't buy voices, they buy fantasies. And so, the transformation began. Mills gave him a moniker so bizarre, so completely unforgettable, that it demanded immediate attention. Engelbert Humperdinck, borrowed from a deceased German composer. But the name was just the packaging. Management meticulously stripped away every ounce of Arnold's gritty, working-class reality. They taught him how to walk, how to smile, and how to gaze into a camera lens so that every single woman watching felt like he was singing exclusively to her. He was wrapped in bespoke suits and ordered to project an aura of effortless, flawless romance. The strategy worked better than anyone could have ever predicted. In 1967, his breakout hit, "Release Me," exploded onto the charts with such ferocity that it notoriously kept the Beatles' masterpiece, Penny Lane, from reaching #1 in the UK. Overnight, Engelbert was no longer a man, he was a god. Women literally threw themselves at him. They tore at his clothes, stormed his hotels, and screamed his name until they passed out. But behind the blinding flashbulbs, the psychological pressure of maintaining this spotless persona was quietly destroying him. Management enforced strict, unbreakable rules. The perfect gentleman could not be seen sweating, struggling, or showing any signs of ordinary human frailty. More importantly, he had to appear perpetually available, a blank canvas for the romantic projections of millions of fans. Arnold Dorsey was a married man with a growing family, but Engelbert Humperdinck had to be the ultimate, untouchable bachelor. The dissonance between the man in the mirror and the idol on the stage began to fracture his identity. He was living a massive, inescapable lie, terrified that one slip-up would send him right back to the poverty he had barely escaped. But the most dangerous part of this glittering illusion wasn't just the psychological toll it took on him. It was the realization that he wasn't in control of his own destiny. Engelbert thought he had finally made it to the top of the mountain, but he soon discovered he was merely a highly profitable puppet on a very short string. The same management team that built his flawless image was quietly manipulating the chessboard behind his back. And as he smiled for the cameras, he was entirely unaware that the very men who created him were already grooming his ultimate replacement. What sinister industry forces were forcing him to live this massive lie, and who was the rival they were secretly weaponizing against him? While Engelbert was desperately trying to keep the fractured pieces of his fabricated identity together, Gordon Mills was already playing a much darker, much more manipulative game. Mills wasn't just managing the king of romance. He was simultaneously managing a sweaty, hip-thrusting Welsh powerhouse named Tom Jones. On the surface, the two men couldn't have been more different. Engelbert was the velvet-voiced gentleman, the sophisticated balladeer who crooned to the ladies with a gentle wink. Tom was raw, unbridled sex appeal, tearing off his shirt and catching the underwear thrown at him on stage. But despite their contrasting personas, they were fighting a vicious, zero-sum war for the exact same demographic, the exact same spotlight, and the exact same throne. The press loved to paint them as best mates. Magazines splashed photos of the two superstars sharing laughs, clinking glasses, and playfully jabbing at each other in what looked like a friendly, brotherly rivalry. It was a brilliant PR spin, but it was an absolute lie. Behind closed doors, the relationship was toxic, fueled by a deeply ingrained, bitter jealousy that would ultimately define a decade of both their lives. They despised sharing the same management. They despised sharing the same record label. And most of all, they despised the fact that Gordon Mills was actively pitting them against each other like prize gladiators in a corporate arena. Mills was a master manipulator. If Engelbert started demanding too much control, Mills would casually mention Tom's latest chart-topping success. If Tom got too arrogant, Mills would remind him of Engelbert's massive record sales. This created an atmosphere of absolute paranoia. The backstabbing over material was relentless. In this cutthroat environment, a hit song was the ultimate currency, and both men were terrified that the other was getting the better tracks. There were whispered industry legends of frantic late-night phone calls, with both stars demanding first refusal on ballads that could secure their next gold record. It wasn't just about the music. It was about total domination. Rumors swirled in the industry that songs were secretly shifted, that arrangements were stolen, and that studio time was hijacked. It became a petty, ruthless race to out-record, outperform, and completely overshadow one another. When both men eventually conquered Las Vegas, the rivalry escalated from the recording studio to the desert strip. If Tom Jones secured $1 million contract, Engelbert wanted $1,000,001. If Tom had a billboard on the north side of the strip, Engelbert demanded a bigger one on the south. The pressure to remain the supreme alpha male of pop music meant that every single night on stage was a high-stakes battle for relevance. He couldn't just be good. He had to prove unequivocally that he was better than Tom. The sheer exhaustion of trying to constantly one-up his greatest rival pushed Engelbert's already massive ego into the stratosphere. The gentlemanly facade he had so carefully crafted was beginning to crack under the weight of his own hubris. The true depth of this hatred wouldn't become public knowledge until decades later, when the polite masks finally slipped. Long after their vocal peaks, the two men would publicly exchange vicious insults, with Tom Jones famously dropping expletives when asked about Engelbert in modern interviews, proving that the wounds from the 1960s and 70s had never truly healed. Engelbert would fire back, calling Tom a faded star. It was a tragic, bitter end to a dynamic that had defined an era of music. But during those golden years, as Engelbert poured all of his energy into defeating Tom Jones and securing his legacy as the ultimate pop icon, he was completely neglecting the actual reality of his life. The intense rivalry, the endless touring, and the absolute worship from millions of women had created a perfect storm of temptation. Engelbert Humperdinck had convinced himself that he was a god, and gods don't have to play by the rules of mortal men. While he was fiercely defending his public crown against Tom Jones, the private kingdom he had built at home was actively crumbling. Just how dark did things get? And how did his fiercely loyal wife truly react to the devastating secrets he kept bringing back to their seemingly perfect home? While Engelbert was out fiercely defending his musical crown against Tom Jones, the private kingdom he had built at home was quietly, tragically crumbling. To understand the sheer hypocrisy of this era, you have to look at the music he was famous for. Night after night, he stood under the spotlight, crooning tracks like After the Lovin' and The Last Waltz, selling a deeply intoxicating fantasy of eternal, unwavering loyalty. Millions of women wept to his records, believing he was the ultimate devoted partner. But the dark reality behind closed doors painted a much more devastating picture. The king of romance was, in truth, a relentless, unrepentant philanderer whose private life completely contradicted his pristine public image. At the center of this gathering storm was Patricia Healy, the woman who had married Arnold Dorsey long before the bespoke suits, the screaming mobs, and the multi-million-dollar record deals. Patricia was his anchor, the mother of his children, and the only person who truly knew the fragile, insecure man hiding behind the towering Engelbert Humperdinck persona. But as his global fame skyrocketed, the man she married began to vanish, replaced by an ego-driven superstar who was constantly intoxicated by his own myth. The road was a dangerous, temptation-filled playground. Women didn't just attend his sold-out concerts. They stalked his hotels, bribed his security guards, and willingly offered themselves up to him on a nightly basis. In the hypermasculine, morally bankrupt culture of the 1970s entertainment industry, infidelity wasn't just common. It was almost an expectation among top-tier stars. Engelbert quickly learned to aggressively compartmentalize his life. There was the dutiful family man who returned to a sprawling estate in the English countryside. And then there was the voracious, unapologetic playboy who conquered Las Vegas. For years, he selfishly justified his relentless cheating as simply being an inescapable hazard of the job. He convinced himself that as long as he always came home and provided a lavish lifestyle, his physical betrayals didn't actually mean anything. But he severely underestimated the crushing psychological toll this double life was taking on the woman who loved him most. Patricia wasn't blind, and she certainly wasn't foolish. She read the tabloid whispers. She noticed the unexplained absences, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume, and the subtle, guilty shifts in his demeanor every time he returned from a grueling international tour. Being married to a global sex symbol meant sharing her husband with millions of women who firmly believed they had a right to him. For a long time, Patricia adopted a heartbreaking policy of silent endurance. She swallowed her immense pride to keep the family intact, choosing to look the other way rather than blow up the life they had sacrificed so much to build together. It was a profoundly lonely, isolating existence, heavily masked by the glittering illusion of wealth and Hollywood privilege. But Engelbert mistook her agonizing silence for permission. His ego swelled to such colossal proportions that he began to feel entirely invincible, behaving as if his actions had absolutely no real-world consequences. He took her profound loyalty completely for granted, treating her unwavering support as a permanent safety net that allowed him to walk a highly dangerous tightrope without a harness. He was the perfect gentleman on television, yet a profoundly selfish husband in reality, leaving a trail of broken promises in his wake. The delicate, unspoken truce between Engelbert and Patricia might have limped along indefinitely if his indiscretions had remained just fleeting, anonymous encounters in dimly lit hotel rooms. But extreme arrogance always breeds extreme carelessness. Engelbert's reckless behavior was about to shatter his carefully constructed bubble of invincibility. It was one thing for his wife to ignore the quiet rumors of passing groupies, but it was entirely another when one of those late-night mistakes stepped boldly out of the shadows, armed with lawyers and a demand for undeniable justice. The king of romance had left behind more than just a broken heart. He had left behind a living, breathing consequence. Just how fiercely would his ruthless management team fight to bury the truth when a massive, highly publicized scandal threatened to destroy everything he had built? The glittering illusion of invincibility shattered entirely in the late 1970s. Engelbert Humperdinck, the man who had effortlessly navigated decades of fame by keeping his darkest secrets hidden behind a velvet curtain, suddenly found himself standing directly in the harsh, unforgiving glare of a legal spotlight. The catalyst wasn't a jealous rival or a vindictive ex-manager. It was a woman named Kathy Jeter, and she wasn't just claiming to have had a brief, passionate affair with the king of romance. She was holding a trump card that threatened to bankrupt him, publicly humiliate his fiercely loyal wife, and destroy his entire career overnight. She was claiming he was the father of her child. When the massive paternity lawsuit hit the press, It was an absolute media circus. The tabloids, which had spent years gleefully pushing the narrative of Engelbert as the ultimate, sophisticated gentleman, aggressively changed their tune. They smelled blood in the water. Headlines screamed about the secret life of the superstar, exposing the ugly, chaotic reality of his endless infidelities to the very audience that bought his records. The perfectly manicured image Gordon Mills had spent years building was suddenly covered in mud. For Engelbert, the situation wasn't just highly embarrassing. It was an existential threat. If his core demographic of swooning, romantic women believed he was a deadbeat father who callously abandoned a child, his record sales would plummet, and his lucrative Las Vegas residencies would vanish. The legal battle that followed was vicious, protracted, and shockingly aggressive. Engelbert's high-priced legal team, funded by his massive, untouchable empire, immediately went on the offensive. They didn't just deny the allegations. They attempted to systematically dismantle Jetter's credibility. They dragged the case through the courts for years, utilizing every legal loophole, delay tactic, and aggressive maneuver available to suppress the truth. To the outside world, Engelbert projected absolute, unwavering confidence, angrily dismissing the claims as a pathetic, money-grabbing extortion attempt by a desperate fan. He stood before the cameras, flashing his trademark smile, and swore on his reputation that the child was not his. But behind closed doors, the pressure was completely unbearable. Patricia, who had endured decades of silent humiliation, was now forced to suffer the ultimate indignity in front of the entire world. The private pain of his infidelity was now public entertainment, and Engelbert was frantically scrambling to put the genie back in the bottle. He was bleeding money. The legal fees were astronomical, and the hush money required to keep other potential scandals from erupting simultaneously was quietly draining his immense fortune. It was during this desperate, chaotic period that Engelbert finally agreed to a blood test, confident that it would definitively clear his name and destroy the lawsuit forever. The results were a devastating, undeniable catastrophe. The court ruled that Engelbert Humperdinck was indeed the father. The verdict sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. The king of romance had been caught in a massive, prolonged, and legally proven lie. He was court-ordered to pay significant child support, but the financial hit was nothing compared to the catastrophic damage to his pride. He had been publicly exposed not just as a cheater, but as a man who would aggressively weaponize his wealth and power to ruin a woman's reputation just to protect his own ego. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of this humiliating defeat, as the massive legal bills were being settled and his management team frantically tried to spin the PR disaster, Engelbert experienced a terrifying moment of clarity. He began to look closely at the financial ledgers he had blindly trusted others to maintain for over a decade. He saw the exorbitant fees, the mysterious offshore accounts, and the highly questionable investments made in his name. As the staggering costs of the paternity scandal mounted, what horrifying realization did he have about the people who had been secretly managing and systematically draining his vast, hard-earned fortune? The devastating fallout from the paternity scandal was just the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying nightmare. Engelbert Humperdinck had spent the last 2 decades selling over 100 million records globally. He had sold out the London Palladium, conquered the charts, and lived a life of absolute, undeniable luxury. But as he nervously audited his own empire in the wake of his massive legal bills, the chilling truth finally snapped into focus. The king of romance was dangerously close to being completely broke. The realization hit him like a physical blow. How could a man who had generated hundreds of millions of dollars be staring at financial ruin? The answer lay in the brutal, predatory nature of the music industry in the 1960s and 70s, an era notorious for exploitative contracts and managers who viewed artists not as human beings, but as infinitely replaceable cash cows. Engelbert discovered that the same management team that had brilliantly crafted his spotless image had also meticulously crafted legal agreements that heavily favored their own bank accounts. He was locked into contracts where he saw only a fraction of the immense profits his voice generated. His massive royalty checks were being severely diluted by hidden fees, dubious investments, and exorbitant management commissions that he had blindly signed away when he was just desperate, starving Arnold Dorsey. To mask the hemorrhaging of his wealth and maintain the lavish lifestyle expected of a global superstar, Engelbert was forced into a grueling, soul-crushing cycle of constant performance. Las Vegas, the glittering oasis that had once represented the absolute pinnacle of his success, slowly transformed into a gilded cage. He became a prisoner to his own massive success, shackled to relentless residency contracts that required him to perform 2 shows a night, week after week, month after month. He wasn't singing for the sheer joy of the music anymore. He was singing out of pure, terrifying desperation. He was singing to pay the mounting legal fees, to cover the immense overhead of his sprawling estates, and to keep the predatory wolves firmly away from his door. The physical and psychological toll of this endless grind was immense. The pristine velvet voice that had seduced millions began to show signs of severe exhaustion. Night after night, he plastered on the trademark smile, squeezed into the tailored tuxedos, and delivered the exact same hits to audiences that expected absolute perfection. He was completely trapped in a nostalgic time loop, unable to evolve as an artist because his survival depended entirely on playing the hits that paid the bills. The resentment quietly festered inside him. He realized that Gordon Mills and the unseen executives were sitting comfortably in luxurious offices, profiting immensely off the sweat pouring down his face under the blinding Vegas lights. Engelbert's massive ego, which had previously shielded him from his own insecurities, was violently stripped away. He had always believed he was the master of his own destiny, the untouchable alpha male who had defeated Tom Jones and conquered the world. But the harsh financial reality proved he was little more than a highly paid employee in a rigged corporate machine. To survive, he had to aggressively sever ties with the people who had built him, resulting in bitter, highly publicized legal battles that further drained his dwindling resources. He was fighting for his financial life, desperately trying to reclaim ownership of the name, the image, and the legacy he had bled to create. Eventually, through sheer, stubborn willpower and relentless touring, Engelbert managed to stabilize his finances. He clawed his way back from the brink of total ruin, slowly taking absolute control of his own business affairs. But the victory felt incredibly hollow. The decades of stress, the endless betrayals, and the constant need to project invincibility had deeply hardened him. He thought he had survived the darkest chapter of his life, finally securing the peace and financial independence he had always craved. But fate had a much crueler, deeply personal tragedy waiting for him just around the corner. When the glitz of Vegas faded and the lawsuits were finally settled, what devastating, unstoppable force would enter his home and completely destroy the man he thought he was? Engelbert had survived the vicious rivalries, the humiliating public scandals, and the terrifying brink of financial ruin. By all accounts, he had finally earned the right to gracefully enjoy the massive empire he had spent 50 years aggressively defending. But life rarely adheres to a fair script. Just as the relentless chaos of his career began to quiet down, a silent, invisible thief slipped into his sprawling estate and began systematically stealing the one thing his immense wealth could not protect: his wife's mind. Patricia, the fiercely loyal anchor who had endured his decades of staggering selfishness, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis completely shattered Engelbert's reality. For his entire adult life, he had been the center of the universe. The world revolved around his schedules, his ego, and his massive career. Patricia had always been the quiet, enduring force in the background, cleaning up his messes and holding the family together while he conquered the globe. But Alzheimer's does not care about platinum records, and it certainly does not care about fame. As the cruel disease progressed, it slowly and methodically erased the brilliant, resilient woman he had married. The devastating cruelty of the illness forced a massive, highly uncomfortable role reversal. The wandering, self-absorbed superstar had to become the desperate, heartbroken caretaker. Engelbert was suddenly entirely powerless, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was the starving, desperate Arnold Dorsey. He threw millions of dollars at the best doctors, exploring experimental treatments and utilizing every possible medical resource available to halt the cognitive decline. But the disease was relentless. He watched in profound agony as Patricia began to forget the details of their life together. She forgot the sprawling estates. She forgot the glittering nights in Las Vegas. And eventually, she began to forget him. The man who had spent a lifetime singing about eternal, unwavering devotion was now being forced to truly understand what those lyrics actually meant. The guilt he experienced during this period was absolutely crushing. He spent endless nights sitting by her side, haunted by the brutal realization that he had squandered their best years chasing validation from strangers. He had taken her profound loyalty completely for granted, assuming she would always be waiting for him when the applause finally stopped. Now, she was slowly slipping away, and all the apologies he had saved for their twilight years were useless, because she could no longer understand them. He had spent decades being a terrible husband, and now, he was desperately trying to make up for a lifetime of mistakes in the few, fleeting moments she had left. He practically abandoned his grueling tour schedule, refusing to leave her side for more than a few days at a time. He learned how to feed her, how to soothe her when the confusion caused intense panic, and how to find fleeting moments of joy in an otherwise suffocating situation. His massive, legendary ego was fundamentally destroyed by the daily indignities of the disease. He was no longer the untouchable king of romance. He was just a deeply flawed, grieving old man, begging the universe for just one more day with the only woman who had ever truly known him. In a heartbreaking twist of fate, the music that had once driven a massive wedge between them became their final, fragile connection. Even when Patricia couldn't remember her own name, she would sometimes recognize his voice. Engelbert would sit by her bed and softly sing the ballads that had made him famous, watching tears quietly form in her empty eyes. It was a brutal, beautiful testament to a deeply complicated love story. But as the disease finally claimed her life in 2021, leaving Engelbert utterly devastated and entirely alone in his massive home, he was left entirely alone with his memories. And in the agonizing silence that followed her death, what haunting, unresolved secret from the peak of his fame would finally force him to break his silence and confess the truth to the world? The silence in the sprawling estate is now deafening. At 90 years old, Engelbert Humperdinck sits alone, surrounded by walls plastered with gold records, framed photographs with presidents, and the lingering ghosts of a life lived entirely at top speed. The tailored tuxedos hang in a closet, and the roaring crowds are nothing more than a distant, echoing memory. He has outlived his fierce rivals, he has outlasted his predatory managers, and he has survived the vicious tabloid scandals that tried to destroy him. But surviving is not the same as being at peace. Now, in the twilight of his deeply complicated life, the man who spent a half-century meticulously projecting the illusion of the perfect gentleman is finally ready to strip away the very last layer of the facade. Looking back at his towering legacy, Engelbert is fiercely proud of the music, the millions of records sold, and the sheer grit it took to climb from the poverty of Leicester to the glittering heights of Las Vegas. But the immense pride is heavily shadowed by a crushing, inescapable guilt. He fully admits, with a raw, unflinching honesty that was entirely absent during his prime, that the massive fame fundamentally warped him. He allowed the towering myth of Engelbert Humperdinck to entirely consume the reality of Arnold Dorsey. He admits to the staggering selfishness, the endless string of broken promises, and the immense pain he inflicted on the one person who deserved his absolute best. He acknowledges that his legendary rivalry with Tom Jones, which had consumed so much of his energy and fueled so much of his anger, was ultimately a deeply hollow pursuit. They were just two insecure men manipulated by a ruthless industry, fighting a pointless war over an imaginary crown. He looks back at the paternity scandal not as an isolated mistake, but as the inevitable consequence of a man who firmly believed he was entirely above the rules. The financial ruin, the brutal lawsuits, the endless betrayals. He views them now as the heavy, unavoidable toll for living a life completely detached from reality. But it is the loss of Patricia that truly shattered the final remnants of his ego. Her heartbreaking battle with Alzheimer's forced him to confront the devastating impermanence of everything he had spent his life building. He realizes now that the millions of adoring fans, the massive fortunes, and the roaring applause meant absolutely nothing when he was sitting alone in a quiet room, desperately holding the hand of a woman who could no longer remember his name. He has spent the years since her death completely redefining his legacy, not as an untouchable superstar, but as a deeply flawed man trying to find redemption in his final act. He still occasionally steps onto a stage, though the movements are slower and the velvet voice now carries the heavy, fragile rasp of time. But he no longer sings to project an illusion of invincibility. He sings because it is the only way he knows how to grieve. He sings because the music is the only bridge left to the past. He wants his loyal fans to understand that the flawless romantic idol they worshipped never actually existed, but the flawed, deeply regretful man standing before them now is finally entirely real. He has made peace with his ghosts, accepted his massive failures, and embraced the quiet reality of his final days. But as Engelbert Humperdinck reflects on a lifetime of platinum records, soaring triumphs, and irreversible mistakes, he realizes that his greatest performance wasn't on a massive stage in Las Vegas. It was the life he pretended to live off of it. There is, however, one final piece of the puzzle, a deeply buried truth about his final promise to Patricia in her fleeting moments of lucidity, that completely changes the meaning of everything he has ever sung. Final cliffhanger. As Engelbert Humperdinck reflects on a lifetime of platinum records, roaring crowds, and irreversible mistakes, he realizes that his greatest performance wasn't on a stage in Las Vegas. It was the life he pretended to live. But there is one final piece of the puzzle, a deeply buried truth about his final promise to Patricia, that completely changes the meaning of his most famous song. When the truth behind the lyrics is finally exposed, you will never listen to the king of romance the same way again.